Hello and welcome to the program New India Sankalp. The G20 is an important international forum where the leading economies of the world get together and collaborate. The G20 comprises of 19 countries and the European Union. India is a proud member of the Group of 20 and is all set to host the 2022 edition of the G20 Summit. In the backdrop of the recent 2018 G20 Summit, today on the program, we're discussing on the topic India's emerging role in the global economic architecture. And to discuss on the subject here in Delhi Doordarshan studios, I'm joined by four eminent guests. Let me introduce them to you. Please welcome Ambassador B.S. Prakash. Welcome, sir. Namaskar. He's a former diplomat. Please welcome Sri Ajit Pai, OSD Economics and Finance with the Niti Aayog. Professor Meeta Kumar is with us, Associate Professor, Miranda House, Delhi University. And we also welcome Professor Harshvardhan Pant. Namaskar. He is a distinguished fellow with the ORF, that's the Observer Research Foundation. Ambassador Prakash, let me begin by asking you, ever since the G20 was formed in the background of the financial crisis of 2008, over the last decade, how has this group evolved to contribute to global economic stability?
We can think of two different ways in which it has evolved. One is to really solve the crisis which happened in 2008. And if you take the main themes of economic stability, economic growth, and sustainable development, in the last 10 years, issues have changed somewhat, as is natural. But to address these fundamental issues relating to world economy and financial institutions and so on, that's one way. I think an equally significant way in which it has evolved is that it has become an important part of the global decision-making architecture. We had the G77 group of developing countries, we had the G7+1, a group of developed countries. But this has evolved as a forum which really cuts across those divisions and which brings in both the developed world, the most significant economies of the world, which also including emerging countries and BRICS.
Yes.
So there is a qualitative aspect and then there are the issues.
Okay, so it's emerged as a strong group for economic policies that matters to the globe over the last decade. But before I ask about the India's emerging role, let's get a sense of where we do stand in our economic scenario. So if you talk about current fiscal 6 months, we've registered a 7.6 growth rate. Help us understand how is Indian economy progressing?
So right now, when you have a look at the Indian economy, over the past 7 years, we have seen tremendous growth in India's share of the global economy. We have grown from about 2.5% of global GDP in 2010 to about approaching almost 3.5% right now. Less than that, but we should be there. We have moved up in rank. We have moved from being I would say somewhere in the number 6 place right now. We are probably about to become number 5 very soon. So we have become a very, very significant economy in the world today and far more relevant to global growth than we've ever been before.
And this chart that we saw, especially in the green one, talks about the enhancement in the bank credit. So there's been a lot of factors that have contributed to acceleration in the economic growth.
So one of the things that I think this government should be proud of is the fact that despite bank credit growth being as anemic as it has been in the past 4 to 5 years, that the economy has continued to be the fastest growing large economy in the world. So I think what this government has done is it took the opportunity of having this robust growth and environment over here to make some structural changes. So we are talking about formalization of the economy, which reduces the systemic risks that India poses to the global economy as well as internal risks. There was demonetization that was announced that formalized the economy. But subsequent to that, and even I think far more significant, is what's happened with the GST. So as the economy gets formalized, we have a much better sort of understanding of exactly what the economy is doing, much better data and more timely data. And we can also start using leverage far more effectively. So while India has been gaining tremendous amounts of share, much faster than most other countries in the world right now of global GDP, that trajectory can continue much longer with this better data. And the moment you have better data, then credit can be far more systematic than it was previously.
Right.
That green chart that you saw showed that in the 2010 to 2014 timeframe, that the banks, just subsequent to the world financial crisis, were lending too freely.
Yes.
And the cost of that was what you're looking at right now, which is GNPAs in many sectors, overcapitalization in many sectors.
Yes.
And those costs have been borne over the past 4 years in a cleanup with the banks. So the banks were not lending as much as they could. The good news is that we're at the tail end of that. The acceleration in terms of bank lending has already begun.
Yes.
The September quarter numbers you saw was a deceleration from the June quarter. You had 8.2% growth fall to 7.1.
Yes.
That pocket of air is only going to last one more quarter,
right?
The December quarter. And after that, you should start seeing all the benefits begin to accrue to the economy and a fairly material acceleration, which should sustain India's position as the largest growing or fastest growing large economy in the world.
Right, of course, 8.2% growth in quarter 1, that decelerated to 7.1, but still in the first 6 months, a robust 7.6% growth rate. And we did hear respected RBI Governor Urjit Patel today in the press conference saying that the forecast for the current fiscal 2018-19 is 7.4% growth. But Professor Mehta, while we have the G20 group, the viewers must be wondering, we also have the United Nations, which is a multilateral forum. And if you talk about multilateralism, we also have the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, there's the WTO. Then how do we reconcile the need for G20?
See, most of these institutions have a history to themselves, right? The United Nations came about out of at the end of the Second World War. The IMF and the World Bank were born out of a particular context. The G20 was again born from a particular context. So the World Bank and the IMF, which were the centerpiece of the international financial architecture, have a particular role which they ascribe to the developed nations. The way that it began to be felt that particularly the IMF was being seen to give a more, let's say, was not giving enough voice to the developing nations.
Okay.
So that was the feeling.
Yes.
Then what the G20 does really, as Ambassador Pai was saying, is that it gives voice to emerging nations. Right?
Yes.
And that has been the singular achievement of the G20.
Right.
The fact that it incorporates a lot of emerging nations, the fact that it incorporates the BRICS, and the fact that it has now emerged as one body which is making decisions in the international architecture.
Right.
So,
Professor Harsh, how do you see the Buenos Aires 2018 G20 summit? Was it a success for India?
I would think in terms of, even if you're looking at it purely in terms of optics, the fact that India became, or India emerged as one of the few countries that were having these two very important, interesting discussions.
Yes.
One set of discussions with China and Russia at a trilateral, and one set with Japan and America, which the Prime Minister has coined as J. I think this is a very interesting sort of facet of Indian diplomacy and Indian foreign policy, that we are living in a very fluid international context where partnerships are very fluid, and India is one of the few countries that is able to emerge in this fluidity rather seamlessly. So I think that has been a great success in terms of what India could do in terms of reaching out to other stakeholders.
Yes.
The other, I think, important aspect is what the Prime Minister pointed out in terms of his own, putting India's own voice,
yes,
where he talked about issues all the way from WTO to economic offenders,
yes,
to how to change the multilateral context, etc. And I think which was a rather powerful voice. And one thing that I think the world today recognizes is that you cannot run today's global economic environment architecture
yes,
from Washington, London or Paris alone.
Yes.
You have to look at what New Delhi is saying.
Absolutely.
And I think that is one of the very important facets of not only India's engagement with the world,
yes,
but also the recognition that India is getting from the world.
Absolutely. So New Delhi's voice becomes very important, and let's listen in to the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what he said in Buenos Aires, how the economies of the world need to give more space to emerging economies like India.
मल्टीलेटरिज्म और नियम आधारित विश्व व्यवस्था के सामने निरंतर कठिनाइयां आ रही हैं और प्रोटेक्शनिज्म बढ़ रहा है। करेंसी अवमूल्यन और तेल कीमतों में तेज बढ़ोतरी पिछले कुछ वर्षों में अर्जित लाभ को चुनौती दे रहे हैं। ब्रिक्स देश वैश्विक स्थिरता और विकास के योगदान में देते रहे हैं। हमने विश्व की आर्थिक और राजनीतिक संरचना को आकार देने में महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई है। हमने ग्लोबल इकोनॉमिक गवर्नेंस के आर्किटेक्चर को और अधिक प्रतिनिधित्व वाला और लोकतांत्रिक बनाने में सार्थक योगदान दिया है और इस दिशा में आगे भी कार्य करते रहेंगे। हमें संयुक्त राष्ट्र और इसकी सुरक्षा परिषद सहित मल्टीलेटरल इंस्टीट्यूशंस में विकासशील देशों को और अधिक प्रतिनिधित्व दिए जाने पर एक सुर में बात करनी चाहिए। यह वही मकसद है जिसके लिए हम ब्रिक्स में एक साथ आए हैं। हमें नियम आधारित विश्व व्यवस्था को सुनिश्चित करने के लिए यूएन, डब्ल्यूटीओ, यूएनएफसीसी, वर्ल्ड बैंक इत्यादि जैसे मल्टीलेटरल इंस्टीट्यूशंस के साथ मिलकर काम करना होगा, जिससे इनकी प्रासंगिकता बनी रहे और वह समय की वास्तविकताओं को दर्शाएं। इस संबंध में मैंने जोहानिसबर्ग की अपनी मुलाकात में रिफॉर्म मल्टीलेटरलिज्म का सुझाव दिया है।
तो जैसा माननीय प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी कह रहे हैं कि मल्टीलैटरलिज्म इम्पोर्टेंट है और उसमें भारत की आवाज़ विश्व को सुननी होगी। एम्बेसडर प्रकाश, आपसे जानना चाहूँगा, अगर हम मल्टीलैटरलिज्म का इतिहास देखें तो 1865 में इंटरनेशनल टेलीग्राफ यूनियन से लेकर यूनाइटेड नेशन और समय समय पर अन्य एजेंसीज भी बनी हैं। क्यों ज़रूरी है देशों को एक साथ मिलना, और आपको लगता है कि जहाँ तक आर्थिक नीति है इसके लिए मिलना और समय समय पर मिलना बहुत ज़रूरी है?
जैसे प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने कहा अभी जो हमने सुना, एक बात हमें ध्यान में लेना चाहिए। करेंटली वी आर विटनेसिंग ए सर्टन फ्रैगमेंटेशन इन द मल्टीलैटरल सिस्टम। और प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने साफ साफ कहा कि वेदर इट इज़ द वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन और वेदर इट इज़ द क्लाइमेट चेंज इश्यूज और even with regard to the reform of the United Nations itself in the sense of an expansion of the Security Council, जहाँ हमें निर्णय लेना है, हम आजकल ये देख रहे हैं कि there is certain skepticism, even cynicism with regard to multilateralism. Some of it is because of an American posture of expressing doubts about the value of multilateralism, about an America first approach. So आप मुझे पूछ रहे हैं कि मल्टीलैटरलिज्म में क्या है? I think we have by now realized that in a globalized world, problems can only be solved collectively. Okay. It's not easy to solve the problems, but it can be solved collectively. Let us take the most striking example, which is climate change. This can't be solved by any one country. Okay. And this can't be neglected either. We are really reaching a kind of a thoughts about the end of this earth as we know it. So इसको ये समस्या को हल करना है, then countries which are major economies, countries which are major emitters, which are major polluting countries, countries like Maldives which are very small but which may get submerged completely. So it is not one issue, it is not one country. So that is the value of multilateralism. Okay. But what we are seeing today, and this is the backdrop to Buenos Aires, is that there is this fragmentation, this fracturing in the consensus that to some extent existed, but that already broke down in the Paris. And just to conclude my thought, I think the theme of this 2018 G20 was building consensus for sustainable development. Yes. इसमें दो मुद्दा है. One is the building consensus aspect. दूसरा जो है, only economic growth and development is not enough, it has to be sustainable. Right. So that's why the meetings are at the summit level, it involves world leaders, and we need a commitment, as the Prime Minister just, we heard him say, yes, towards a reformed multilateralism.
जी बिल्कुल। तो एक इम्पोर्टेंट है कि कंसेंसस कैसे लाएं, मैं ज़रूर उस पर भी पूछूंगा, लेकिन जहाँ तक एजेंडा की बात है अजीत जी, इकोनॉमी में जब इकोलॉजी भी जुड़ता है तो आप कैसे देखते हैं? क्योंकि बात डेवलपमेंट नहीं, सतत विकास यानी सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट की हो रही है।
बिल्कुल। तो जब हम देखते हैं कि विकास के बारे में देखते हैं और डिफरेंस देखते हैं, जो डेवलप्ड नेशंस हैं OECD और फिर जो G20 है, तो देयर आर सम इनहेरेंट कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स देयर। फॉर एग्जांपल, अभी जो डेवलप्ड वर्ल्ड है वो बोल रहे हैं कि कोयला बंद कर दो, पोल्यूटिंग है। हमारे देश में अभी जो प्लांट्स हैं उनको कोयला काफ़ी मिल नहीं रहा, ठीक है, और जो कॉस्ट है, हमने काफ़ी इन्वेस्टमेंट की है ये प्लांट्स में, आप देख रहे हैं, तो वो जो कॉस्ट है इसका वो कौन देगा? तो ये जो इनकम इक्वालिटी है, हमारी जो जीडीपी है, on average per capita GDP of the world relative to India's, India is only 20% of the average of the world, considering it overall, a little less than 20. It's been improving a lot. So in the early 1990s, it was only close to 6% of the global average. We have made tremendous momentum, but you're still 1/20th.
Right.
So now, jab hum dekh rahe hain, the wealthy nations have already developed. They went through this cycle of pollution, everything else 100 years ago.
Right.
Now the question is, who bears the cost of these additional controls? Is it going to be only the developing nations who are already have a much lower per capita GDP?
Yes.
Or is it going to be shared in some way? So there are various proposals. You have the carbon credit proposals, you have various proposals. But what we have to see is what is the fairest.
Right.
And in that, having a dialogue, not just of the OECD and the wealthiest countries, which is a club of everyone, which is 10 to 20 times wealthier per person than India, but including the largest economies. So China and India. China, of course, has a substantially higher per capita GDP, about 4 to 5 times ours. But still, including them makes the conversation fairer.
Right.
And I think that is the way that we'd look at it. What is right for each environment? And the whole world suffers and the whole world gains from what's happening now.
बिल्कुल ठीक. पर प्रोफेसर मीता, जैसा एम्बेसडर भी कह रहे थे कि हर सॉवरेन राष्ट्र अपने हित पहले देखेगा. एक घर परिवार में भी यदि किसी मुद्दे पे कंसेंसस लाना हो तो मुश्किल होता है. 20 मेंबर बॉडीज एक साथ आएँ या मल्टीलैटरलिज्म में जितने भी मेंबर बॉडीज है सारे आएँ, कैसे कंसेंसस बनता है, कैसे एक जॉइंट डिक्लेरेशन होता है, फिर उसका पालन कैसे होता है?
That is simultaneously the problem and the solution, है ना? क्योंकि अगर आप इंटरनेशनल, अनफॉर्चुनेटली इंटरनेशनल आर्किटेक्चर का चैलेंज भी यही है कि नेशनली आपके पास कोर्ट्स हैं, आप एक आर्किटेक्चर खड़ा कर सकते हैं जिसमें कि आप कोर्ट ऑफ लॉ में जाके अगर डिस्प्यूट है तो वो सेटल कर सकते हैं. इंटरनेशनली ऐसा कुछ नहीं है आपके पास. बट इंटरनेशनली आप ये जानते हैं कि कोई अगर डिस्प्यूट होता है उसके और अगर आप उसके implications of not cooperation are very very harsh.
Okay.
क्लाइमेट चेंज जो है वो एक मुद्दा है जिसके implications अभी आप ग्रास्प नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. तो अमेरिका ये कह सकता है कि हम इसको नहीं मानते, प्रेसिडेंट ट्रंप ये कह सकते हैं कि क्लाइमेट चेंज हम दरकिनार करते हैं, हम नहीं उसको तवज्जो देते. पर cooperation for example in the financial markets is very very, क्योंकि सारा जो आपका financial architecture है इस वक्त वो इस पर टिका हुआ है कि पूरी दुनिया इस पर it just has confidence that the dollar is a robust currency.
Right.
And it is only that confidence that is keeping the world financial system going.
But you're saying in a multipolar economy world that's
it
developing.
It is only that confidence. And that confidence results from cooperation in the financial markets.
Right. But can that equation change as well?
It can change very, very quickly.
It can change well.
It can go into a tailspin overnight. And I think people understand that that is a result of cooperation.
Right. So cooperation is very, very essential. So from coordination to cooperation to conciliation, all of these are evolving benefits of multilateralism. But before I ask you the next question, Professor Harsh, since you had mentioned about the trilateral, let's listen in what Prime Minister Modi had to say when he talked about J-A-I.
ये एक बहुत बड़ा अच्छा अवसर है कि लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों को समर्पित अमेरिका, जापान और भारत तीनों मिलकर के विश्व में शांति, समृद्धि और स्थिरता के संबंध में हम मिलकर के क्या भूमिका अदा कर सकते हैं. मेरे लिए खुशी की बात है कि दोनों देश हमारे स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनर रहे हैं, दोनों मेरे अच्छे मित्र रहे. इन तीनों के साथ हमारा मिलकर के काम करना अपने आप में एक सुहाना अवसर है. और ये भी खुशी की बात है, अगर मैं इसको एक अलग एक्रोनॉमी में बोलूं तो जापान, अमेरिका, इंडिया, JAI, इसका भारत के अंदर मतलब होता है जय। जय का मतलब होता है सक्सेस। तो एक प्रकार से ये JAI ये सक्सेस का मैसेज देकर के आज हम एक शुभ शुरुआत कर रहे हैं और ये हमारी व्यवस्था, मैं मानता हूं कि विश्व शांति के लिए, विश्व समृद्धि के लिए एक बहुत बड़ी भूमिका अदा करेगी।
प्रोफेसर हर्षवर्धन पंत हमारे साथ हैं, डिस्टिंग्विश्ड फेलो ORF। आपसे जानना चाहूँगा, चाहे जापान, अमेरिका, इंडिया ट्राइलैटरल हो, जिसकी तस्वीरें हमने देखी, या रशिया, इंडिया, चाइना ट्राइलैटरल हो, या फिर क्वाड, जिसका भारत हिस्सा है 4 देशों में, क्या ये मेयर ऑप्टिक्स हैं? क्या ये सिर्फ फोटो अपॉर्चुनिटी है? इसे हम कैसे पढ़ें?
नहीं, मुझे तो ये बड़ा फैसिनेटिंग एक डिप्लोमेटिक मूव लगता है। देखिए, दो प्रधानमंत्री का जो आपने पहला स्टेटमेंट सुनाया था, उसमें वो बार बार ये बात कह रहे हैं कि रूल्स बेस्ड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर हमको चाहिए।
राइट।
अब आप देखिए जय में क्या समस्या है। जय किस चीज़ को एड्रेस कर रहा है? जो जय है वो इस चीज़ को एड्रेस कर रहा है कि चीन मैरिटाइम ऑर्डर में रूल्स को नहीं मान रहा है।
अच्छा।
तो हम वहाँ पर इकट्ठे हुए लाइक माइंडेड कंट्रीज़ के साथ, जो वो जापान है, अमेरिका है, जो ये कह रहे हैं कि हमको इस एक रूल्स बेस्ड मैरिटाइम ऑर्डर को प्रोटेक्ट करना है।
अच्छा।
वो हमारे हित में है।
तो ये जो इंडिया पैसिफिक सिक्योरिटी है, उसके लिए जय काम
उसके लिए इंडो पैसिफिक और क्वाड भी उसका एक एक्सटेंशन है। अब आप दूसरी तरफ चले जाएं, जो रशिया, इंडिया, चाइना ट्राइलैटरल है, वो भी रूल्स बेस्ड के लिए, क्योंकि वहाँ पर हम ये कह रहे हैं कि अमेरिका जो है वो प्रोटेक्शनिज्म करा रहा है, अमेरिका प्रोटेक्शनिस्ट बन रहा है, तो वो जो ग्लोबल इकोनॉमिक रूल्स बेस्ड ऑर्डर है उसको तोड़ रहा है। तो कहीं पर हमने जो फंडामेंटल वैल्यू है रूल्स बेस्ड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर, जिसका जो भारत चाहता है प्रोटेक्टेड रहे और जिसमें भारत का हित समावेश किया हो, हितों का समावेश है, वो मुझे लगता है बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंगली डिप्लोमेटिकली प्ले आउट हो रहा है। तो ये अपने आप में बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है। जैसे मैंने पहले कहा कि आप दोनों प्लेटफॉर्म्स पर जा सकते हैं, आप दोनों जगह ये कह सकते हैं कि हमारा जो बड़ा हित है वो रूल्स बेस्ड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर में है, और इसके चलते हम रशिया के साथ भी बात करेंगे, चीन के साथ भी बात करेंगे, और अमेरिका और जापान के साथ भी बात करेंगे। बहुत ज़्यादा देश दुनिया में इस समय नहीं है जो इस परिस्थिति में हो जहाँ पर दोनों की सुनवाई हो। तो मुझे लगता है भारत को इसमें काफ़ी डिप्लोमेटिकली इज़ अ वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट मूव बाय इंडिया, एंड इट विल पे इंडिया great dividends.
Right. Well, it should pay India great dividend. You're watching the program New India Sankalp. Mumbai is the commercial capital of the country. Let's now hop across to Mumbai, from where we are now joined by Chartered Accountant Sunil Patodia. Thank you very much, Sunil ji, for joining us on the program. Your thoughts on the topic of discussion today, India's emerging role in global economic architecture.
Namaste, Amit ji.
Namaskar.
As we just see, our Prime Minister described about the J. What I understand, that prosperity of India is good for Japan, good for America, and good for the world as a whole. And when we see the talent, the emerging talent of India, we have all type of professional, and we are the best brain of the world. So in the time to come, whether chartered accountants and our IT professional and our lawyers, we will be able to give the all G20 countries the best which needed in time to come. And in 2022, we will be emerging as a best available resources of anything.
Right. Interesting that you mentioned that, because in 2022, India will also be hosting for the first time the World Congress of Accountants, apart from hosting the G20 summit. Since one of the key themes, Sunil ji, at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires was the future of work, how do you see the future of work, especially the professional services, especially when we are talking about we are amidst the 4th industrial revolution?
Yeah. Sir, this IFRS, which is implemented most of the countries, India has just emerged as Ind-AS compliant professionals, and GST is one thing where we are just transforming ourselves, and by 2022, India will be a digested force of the entrepreneurs, and GST is one thing which is formalizing the Indian economy, and it is backed by IBC. We can understand that once the IBC is implemented effectively, the real entrepreneurs will be able to get the bank finances smoothly, and the culprits will be out of the finance system.
Right. You rightly mentioned that GST, one nation, one tax, or the IBC, which is a deterrent for willful defaulters. We talked about the bank credit enhancement. These are the structural reforms that has pushed India's economy and therefore a greater voice at a forum like G20. CS Sunil Patodia, thank you so much for joining us from Mumbai. Thank you very much. कार्यक्रम में वक्त है एक छोटे से ब्रेक का। ब्रेक के बाद जब लौटेंगे तो G20 और भारत का विश्व अर्थव्यवस्था में जो बढ़ता वर्चस्व है उस पर ये बातचीत जारी रहेगी।
सितारों की दुनिया, सुरों की मिठास, फिल्मी सफर का हर एक मोड़, लेजेंड्स की कुछ दिलचस्प बातें, अदाकारी, अंदाज और अदाएं, सिर्फ हमारी जुबानी। तो देखना न भूलिए चित्रहार, बुधवार और शुक्रवार शाम 5 बजे सिर्फ डीडी नेशनल पर।
You're watching New India Sankalp. Ambassador B.S. Prakash is with us. Ambassador, a lot of people say, sometimes maybe on lighter note as well, that the next wars are not going to be fought on territorial wars, but trade wars. How do you see the equation when we hear a particular country imposing tariffs on the other country? Is that going to be the order, or the truce that we hear will stay?
First of all, I don't fully agree with the proposition even lightheartedly made that the next wars will be trade wars. I would say who knows?
Okay.
Because I keep hearing that the next wars could be cyber wars, next wars could be intelligence wars. I think the world is changing too fast for us to have any certainties about the kind of conflicts that we would see. With regard to trade wars, it is a serious concern, and what we are witnessing now, in my view, and this is my view, is more a reflection of President Trump's personality rather than a structural reason why there should be trade wars of this nature.
But when an influential political leader from any of the member nation of G20 or otherwise makes a statement, it does impact the economy?
Absolutely, and we are seeing that. But I think let us say, it was called a major trade dispute, what happened between the US and Canada and the US and Mexico. But they reached some kind of ad hoc solutions, and we don't know how the solutions are significantly different from what the original structure was. Similarly, with regard to the most important issue now, with regard to the differences between the US and China, I think there are major problems. These are the world's number 1 and number 2 economies. There are structural reasons why the Chinese economy is strong and aggressively competitive. The reasons for worry in the US. Then there are also these issues of Brexit in Europe and a fragmentation there, and that will lead to all kinds of trade disputes. But as Professor Pant said earlier, if we believe in a rule-based system, and after all the World Trade Organization has evolved over so many years, there are problems with the WTO, but the problems are that the dispute settlement mechanism is too slow, that there is not enough faith in the arbitration, and the WTO is grabbing space, is going into areas like services, of which there is uncertainty. I would not like to think that the next wars will be trade wars, because security, the traditional conflicts are still a major issue in the world. And incidentally, the significance of the G20 is that though it started with a focus on the economy, it comes to address all issues. Like for instance, this time, as you mentioned, there is the issue of the employment, there is the issue of the women's empowerment, there is the issue of fugitives from justice, the corruption in countries. So I think one way of looking at it, I would say, is that you manage the present problems and don't have a grand design for the future. To me, it seems to be that is the direction in which these discussions are proceeding, because again, to repeat my theme, there is just too much turmoil in the world for us to be sure about the future of where the G20 agenda will take us.
But the uncertainty will always be there, Ajit. But like in the previous quarter, US-UK economy did pick up. But if there is a sluggishness in the global economy, and India is one of the fastest large economies.
It is the fastest large economy.
Then is India ready to leverage possible opportunities of increased FDI and FPI here?
So To place it in context right now, while India is the fastest growing large economy in the world, and fortunately or unfortunately, our relative share of global trade is actually much lower than our percentage of global GDP.
Okay.
So this is a reflection both of our limited imports, but also of our limited exports. So we have not been very competitive in the past. Over the past several years, we've been taking steps to improve our competitiveness there. In services, we've been very successful, but relative to goods and a program that they have, the Make in India, is sort of one sort of move to try and change that. But these things take time. But when we look at it from a global perspective, there is one which is about the trade,
yes,
and there's one about actually getting greater participation from the world. So on the FDI and the FPI front, we are actually doing very well. FPI is very fickle, it comes and goes. So if you look at the FPI over the past, I would say 7-8 years, you'll see that it flows out, it flows in, whether it's debt or it's equity. But FDI is on the ground in India, and it has many benefits.
Okay.
One of the biggest benefits of the FDI is that you have someone outside the country that is very interested in what's in your country succeeding.
Yes.
So not only does it bring in better capability, not only does it bring in jobs, it also aligns interests. So FDI is something that I think over the past 4 to 5 years has done very well, and it's continued to do well through this term. So from the long-term perspective, we know that India's prospects are good, and most of the countries that are sending that money in believe the same.
बिल्कुल, लेकिन प्रोफेसर मीता, अगर फॉरेन इन्वेस्टमेंट आती है या घरेलू हो इन्वेस्टमेंट हो, क्या इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सेक्टर सबसे ज़्यादा बढ़िया सेक्टर रहेगा? क्योंकि लॉन्ग टर्म इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर से आएगी.
इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सेक्टर डेफिनेटली बढ़िया रहेगा, क्योंकि इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के बिना इकोनॉमी नहीं ग्रो करेगी. पर आई एम नॉट टू श्योर आपका सवाल मतलब
क्या गत वर्षों में आपको लगता है कि इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में निवेश काफी गया है, उसने पुश किया है भारतीय इकोनॉमी को, आगे भी इंफ्रा पे ज्यादा फोकस रहे?
पर केवल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पे निवेश करने से काम नहीं बनेगा ना. मतलब आपको इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज वन पार्ट ऑफ व्हाट इज गोइंग टू पुश योर इकोनॉमी. आपको लोग भी चाहिए. I think one of the major problems that the economy is facing is skills. और Skill India एक बहुत बड़ा program है, पर one of the things that I think we need as a teacher, one of the things that I feel we lack and we haven't been able to do is we haven't been able to teach our children to learn. हमारे पास जो स्टूडेंट्स आ रहे हैं उनमें एक जो कमी मैं महसूस करती हूँ कि हम उनको सीखना नहीं सिखा पा रहे हैं.
जी बिल्कुल, और इसमें तो टीचर और प्रोफेसर का योगदान है. तो जैसे आप तो किंग्स कॉलेज लंदन में भी पढ़ाते हैं इंटरनेशनल अफेयर्स, स्टूडेंट्स में उत्सुकता है इस विषय को जानने की, इकोनॉमी से जुड़ने की?
मुझे लगता है और आई थिंक एट सम लेवल आपको और मेरे ख्याल से पिछले कुछ सालों में एक एफर्ट हुआ है जिसमें कि आपने एजुकेशन सेक्टर को थोड़ा सा रीओरिएंट करने की कोशिश करी है, क्योंकि एजुकेशन के कई मायने हो सकते हैं. आप उसको एक स्टैंडर्ड एजुकेशन प्रोविजन भी हो सकता है. आप उसको स्किल से, अगर आप उसको स्किल से लिंक कर दें और आप ये देखें कि वेदर व्हाट इज़ द वैल्यू एडेड दैट वी आर प्रोवाइडिंग टू आवर स्टूडेंट्स, तो कहीं पर अगर आप इनफैक्ट जो आपके स्मॉल टाउन है इंडिया में, वहाँ पर जो एनर्जी है स्टूडेंट्स में, जो एक जोश है, वो बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है, क्योंकि वो कहीं पर वो भी शायद अपने एजुकेशन सिस्टम से उतने खुश नहीं है. वो भी और एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं, क्योंकि उनकी जो एस्पिरेशनल इंडिया की हम बात करते हैं वो वहीं पर है. तो उस एस्पिरेशनल इंडिया को टैप करना, मुझे लगता है जो डायरेक्शन है गवर्नमेंट का वो बिल्कुल सही है कि अनलेस you tap into the aspirations of ordinary Indian youth, you will not be able to cross into the what you call as the fourth industrial revolution. After all, that is part of the, that is the bigger thing coming. Employment is not going to be this employment. In 5 years down the line, you're going to talk of a very different set of propositions about employment and jobs. So unless you can match the aspirations of this youth with the kind of job profile that you are able to provide, you will be in a fix. And I think that is what the conversation at G20 was also about. One important aspect of that conversation was what to do with the future.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that India has in a very advantageous position is the huge demographic dividend and a significant percentage of the youth population. But talking about the infra sector, let's look into some glimpses of the Bharatmala and the Sagarmala projects, how road is connecting with economic possibilities.
Roads are the real reflections of the growth path of a nation. Connecting villages with cities, the hinterlands with heartlands, the remote places with the economic centers, roads actually link people with possibilities. The country witnessed its first major highway development program, the NHDP, in the form of development of Golden Quadrilateral and North-South and East-West corridors, initiated by the then Prime Minister Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1998. This initiative has contributed towards phenomenal growth in economic activity along the developed corridors. Subsequent phases of NHDP focused on improving connectivity to state capitals and district headquarters on standalone project development, leading to infrastructural inconsistencies on key routes. For example, the economically important route connecting Mumbai-Kolkata currently has a mix of 2-lane, 4-lane and 6-lane infrastructures. While NHDP is going to run its course now, the government has planned a major leap forward for integrating development of highways in the country on a corridor-based approach under Bharat Mala Pariyojana.
कि राष्ट्र को सशक्त बनाने में, राष्ट्र को समृद्ध बनाने में, राष्ट्र को गतिशील बनाने में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर अहम भूमिका अदा करता है। जैसे शरीर की मजबूती का कारण शरीर की नसों का रोल है, वैसे ही राष्ट्र की मजबूती का आधार इस इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पर है, रोड नेटवर्क पर है।
Cumulatively, these 6 components involve 65,400 kilometers of road length, out of which development of 24,800 kilometers is being taken up in the first phase till the year 2022 at an estimated investment of 5,35,000 crore rupees. The balance roads will be further upgraded under phase 2 of Bharat Mala Pariyojana.
अजीत पई जी नीति आयोग से आज कार्यक्रम में हमारे साथ हैं। अजीत जी, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की बात करें, रेलवेज़ की बात करें, लॉजिस्टिक्स की बात करें, नए पोर्ट्स के निर्माण की बात करें, इसका असर किस तरह देखते हैं? आपकी इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटीज़ बढ़ेंगी, रोज़गार के अवसर भी बढ़ेंगे, निवेश भी होगा?
बिल्कुल। तो ये सारे जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के आपने जो मेंशन किए हैं लाइंस, ये हमारा जो ओरिजिनल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है वो काफ़ी पुराना है। जैसे रेलवेज़ देखेंगे वगैरह, तो काफ़ी देर के लिए ये इनकी जो एफिशिएंसी है थोड़ा प्लेटो हो गई थी। मगर अभी जो सरकार कर रही है, दे आर ट्राइंग टू सी ये एसेट्स जो हैं, जो स्टेशंस हैं, जो ट्रैक्स हैं वगैरह, इनको ज़्यादा एफिशिएंट कैसे करें। तो कुछ तो बात पीपीपी का चल रहा है, पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप, डिफरेंट कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ एग्जिस्टिंग एसेट्स टू बेटर यूटिलाइज देम। मगर एज वी गो थ्रू ऑल ऑफ दीज, व्हेन वी लुक एट द पोर्ट्स, वी लुक एट ऑल ऑफ दैट, we are looking not just at the government spending, but inviting the public to participate within this, in these PPP programs. So that is things that we are considering actively. This is the base infrastructure of the country. To, we talked about trade, we talked about exports, we talked about imports. तो इनमें रुकावट क्या थे historically? रुकावट था जितना टाइम नॉर्थ से साउथ जाने में लगता था। Now with GST and the e-way bill वो स्पीड अप हो रहा है। कभी कभी 2 हफ्ते लगते थे नॉर्थ से साउथ पहुंचने में। बाहर जो अमेरिका के सेब हमारे नीचे सदर्न इंडिया में पहुंचते थे इन फास्टर टाइम एंड बेटर कंडीशन देन फ्रॉम द नॉर्थ टू द साउथ। अभी वो बदल रहा है।
जी बिल्कुल। और ये तस्वीरें हम देख रहे हैं इनलैंड वाटरवेज। प्रोफेसर हर्ष, आपको लगता है ये भी एक एरिया है जिसे लेवरेज कर सकते हैं कंटेनर ट्रांसपोर्टेशन के लिए?
बिल्कुल। अल्टीमेटली दैट्स द वन ऑफ द चीपेस्ट वेज ऑफ ट्रांसपोर्ट एंड आई थिंक इसको पिछले कुछ सालों में जिस तरह से इस पर इन्वेस्टमेंट और फोकस हो रहा है, मुझे लगता है उसका आपको इम्पैक्ट बिल्कुल देखने को मिलेगा इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी में। और ग्रेजुअली जैसे जैसे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर डेवलप होगा, इसमें आप जॉब्स की बात कर रहे थे, वो भी एक्सपेंशन, जो एरियाज सराउंडिंग फैसिलिटीज़, उसमें जॉब्स की ग्रोथ, इन्वेस्टमेंट की ग्रोथ, उससे एक इकोनॉमिक जो आपका डायमेंशन है उसका बदलना। आई थिंक तो जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की हम बात कर रहे हैं उसको सिर्फ रोड्स या एक पर्टिकुलर फॉर्म में ना देखा जाए, उसको अगर हम एक पूरा एक तरह से मैपिंग करें अगर इंडिया की, और उसमें देखें कि मल्टी मोडल ट्रांसपोर्ट नेटवर्क्स कहाँ कहाँ डेवलप हो रहे हैं और उसके आप कनेक्शंस देखें, तो उसके बहुत लॉन्ग टर्म इंप्लीकेशंस भारत के लिए होंगे।
जी बिल्कुल। चाहे कंस्ट्रक्शन सेक्टर हो प्रोफेसर मीता, माइनिंग सेक्टर हो, जो लोग पहले अनौपचारिक सेक्टर से जुड़े थे, अगर वह भी औपचारिक सिस्टम में आ जाएं तो फिर उनकी आर्थिक स्थिति भी मजबूत होगी। तो क्या कंस्ट्रक्शन, माइनिंग, इन तरह के सेक्टर्स पे भी फोकस और बढ़ना चाहिए?
डेफिनेटली जैसे जैसे इकोनॉमी बढ़ती है तो एक ऑटोमेटिकली ये चेंजेस आएंगे, माने दैट गोज विदाउट सेइंग। वन ऑफ द थिंग्स दैट वी नीड टू थिंक अबाउट इज, देखिए जब जैसे जैसे ये चेंजेस हो रहे हैं, जैसे जैसे एक फॉर्मलाइजेशन हो रहा है कंस्ट्रक्शन में और इन सारे सेक्टर्स में, व्हाट जैसे प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ रही है, वेजेस भी बढ़ेंगे, दैट गोज विदाउट सेइंग। द अदर चेंज दैट इज़ हैपनिंग इज़ दैट ये सारे सेक्टर्स में ऑटोमेशन भी बढ़ रहा है और
उससे भी प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ी है।
much of the growth in all these sectors is no longer going to be as as labor intensive as it used to be.
Okay.
That is something we have to understand.
Right. And you were making another important point that while India will now grow, say, yearly 7.4% and even more in coming months, that's given, but we have to remove the inequalities.
We have to also remember that none of these sectors will generate as much employment as they were generating in the past. So जो जिस तरह का एम्प्लॉयमेंट कंस्ट्रक्शन पहले जनरेट करता था वो अब आगे नहीं करेगा। जिस तरह का एम्प्लॉयमेंट पहले इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर जनरेट करता था वो आगे कोर सेक्टर्स में नहीं करेगा, एंसिलरी एम्प्लॉयमेंट जरूर जनरेट होएगा।
ओके, तो ये शिफ्ट आ सकता है। बट एम्बेसडर, बिफोर वी टॉक अबाउट द सर्विसेज पार्ट, व्हाइल वी आर स्टिल एट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, मैन्युफैक्चरिंग, गुड्स, इक्विपमेंट्स, समटाइम्स व्हेन स्टेप्स आर टेकन बाय द गवर्नमेंट, there could be a criticism as well. What's the need for it? Say, for example, bullet train. How do you view a measure like bullet train that will connect two cities and in a matter of couple of hours you can travel kilometers?
I think India always has lived and will continue to live with some sectors in one century and other sectors in other century.
Okay.
So we will continue to have slow moving trains, but we also need to have very advanced technologies and adaptation. Just as we have the All India Institute of Medical Science and state of the art, let's say heart cardiac care, and at the same time we have primary health centers and still basic needs. This is a reality of India. So I think I regard it as a false kind of a comparison when we say that we cannot afford it, or we cannot really neglect any technology, whether it is nanotechnology or biotechnology or genetics, so on. But if I may, I would also like to say that one of the interesting things in the G20 context about our economy is the emphasis on inclusive growth, because there are countries in G20, all the industrialized countries, for whom growth is an imperative. There are countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, or other countries, like Japan, for whom there are other kinds of, for Saudi Arabia, energy issue will be a major priority.
Okay.
But we are among countries, there are some more, Brazil is another good example, where growth alone is not the priority, but the inclusive aspect of growth, which the Prime Minister always keeps stressing, that is the challenge. And I think the value that India brings to the table, whether it is with regard to digitalization, whether it is with regard to some of these frontier technologies, when these leaders meet, that this should also reach and have an impact and be inclusive. So that political mantra, I think, has to be taken note of by others. And it becomes relevant for all the debates.
Okay, fine. So India, of course, as of now is a $2.5 trillion economy. India aspires to become $5 trillion economy in the course of next 5 to 7 year time horizon. And a bulk of that, $3 trillion, will come from services. We'll take a quick break. On the other side, I'll ask my panelists, how do we view the economic growth in the services sector? आप देख रहे हैं कार्यक्रम न्यू इंडिया संकल्प। प्रोफेसर मीता कुमार दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय से हमारे साथ हैं। प्रोफेसर, अगर हम सर्विसेज की बात करें तो आने वाले इस क्षेत्र में कौन सी ऐसी सेवाएं हैं जिनमें आप युवाओं का ध्यान आकर्षित करना चाहेंगी?
देखिए, सर्विसेज सेक्टर तो सारा ही एक्सपैंड करेगा और आई थिंक जो फॉर्मल सेक्टर सर्विसेज हैं, फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज और insurance or health and education, these are all services which will definitely expand in the near future.
And India could be a big exporter of these services as well?
Definitely healthcare services, geriatric care services, personal care services. Those are services which I think in the near future will expand.
तो प्रोफेसर हर्ष, जैसे G20 में WTO वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को रिफॉर्म करने की बात भी उठी और ये भी कहा गया कि अब 2019 में जापान जब G20 समिट को होस्ट करेगा तब इस पे बातचीत होगी। तो WTO क्या सिर्फ जब ट्रेड की बात करता है, गुड्स की बात करता है, या सर्विसेज की एक्सपोर्ट इंपोर्ट हो तो वो WTO के दायरे में आना चाहिए?
नहीं, आना चाहिए और ये तो भारत की बहुत बड़ी डिमांड रही है। तो अभी जैसे प्रधानमंत्री ने भी G20 में अपना जो वक्तव्य दिया था उसमें काफ़ी स्ट्रेस उन्होंने जब WTO रिफॉर्म्स की बात करी थी तो उन्होंने ये कहा था कि जो सर्विसेज हैं उसको निगलेक्ट नहीं किया जा सकता। आपको सर्विसेज का इम्पैक्ट ट्रेड में क्या हो रहा है और उसको मापने के लिए आपको जो सर्विस सेक्टर डोमिनेटेड कंट्रीज़ हैं उनका आपको उनको इन्वॉल्व करना पड़ेगा डिसीजन मेकिंग में। इसीलिए भारत का रोल बहुत अहम हो जाता है। जो नेक्स्ट जनरेशन ऑफ रिफॉर्म्स आएंगे और पुश हो रहा है जो WTO के रिफॉर्म्स के लिए, वहाँ पर भारत का जो रोल होगा वो मल्टीलैटरल फोरम में काफ़ी इंपॉर्टेंट होगा, क्योंकि भारत अपने आप को एक सर्विस सेक्टर डोमिनेटेड कंट्री के रूप में देखता है और इसीलिए हमेशा से कहता रहा है कि अगर जब आप वर्ल्ड ट्रेड को देख रहे हैं उसको बैलेंस पर्सपेक्टिव में देखिए। उसको इस तरह के डिविजन्स अगर आप कर देंगे तो उसका कोई औचित्य नहीं रह जाता, खासकर आज के ग्लोबलाइज्ड एनवायरनमेंट।
जी बिल्कुल, और अब तो हमने जैसे पहले होता था वैट और सर्विस टैक्स मिलाकर गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज टैक्स भी कर दिया है। तो जैसा प्रोफेसर मीता कह रही थी, फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज यानी वित्तीय सेवाएं भी आकर्षण का केंद्र बन सकता है। आइए जानते हैं कैसे।
The financial service sector is fast emerging as the growth engine with world-class technology, seamless connectivity, state-of-the-art infrastructure and the finest talent pool. Analysts forecast the sector is poised to contribute up to 10 to 11 million jobs by 2020 in India.
Ambassador Prakash, let me ask you, do you think that services is an area where India needs to concentrate more? Because we talk about shift of people from agriculture to services. It's only natural, isn't it?
It is inevitable, it is happening, it is natural. But we also need to do much more in manufacturing, because if you look at the macro economy, then I think one of our weaknesses and one of our challenges would be to improve the manufacturing sector and become competitive. Service sector, we have factor advantages, but then again, as Professor Meeta pointed out, skilling is very important. But then there are other issues also. When we talk of leveraging that advantage, there are issues regarding immigration, migration, all these become issues. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the world is complex, and the G20 shows that. You know, if for instance we have 3 million people already in a country like Saudi Arabia, the entire scale in health services, from top doctors to nurses and to support staff and so on. But how many more will they take? What kind of hospitals will be created in the Gulf, let us say? So all these issues are interrelated to in a certain extent, and there will always be a kind of a competition between the conflicting interests that the G20 countries have. And again, to make a point about the G20, since we are discussing that and India's role in this architecture,
yes,
the decisions in G20 have been by consensus. So all the 20 have to agree, and it has been functioning like that. But different kind of interests will clash at the time to come. So India's diplomatic challenge will be, political and diplomatic challenge will be, how do we navigate these issues in a way where it is just not India's advantage, but also a global balance that we keep in mind.
Absolutely. But since India primarily was always considered an agrarian economy, it perhaps still is, Ajit ji, you were mentioning the best practices in the agriculture sector in some of the developing economies. What is it?
So, when you have a look at agriculture in India today, the good news is that the relative employment over there has gone from 60% to about 45%.
Okay.
So the overall agricultural sector still occupies, that many people.
45%. And the balance 15 would have gone to services?
It has gone to services and some to manufacturing, but mostly to services. But what is the best practices in the world today, when you look at Canada or the US, less than 2% of their population is able to feed 100% of their population. So one of the things that we have to manage very effectively is as we improve the productivity. I think we already had, a couple of the panelists over here talk about improving productivity in manufacturing and in the construction sector. But when you look at that productivity improvement, yes, the future growth of these industries will require fewer people. So we have to figure out how, when India goes from improving its productivity in agriculture, how to manage that pace and how to absorb these people. So that is a long-term concern about this 45% of the population, about how it's going to get absorbed.
How will we do that? Because Niti Aayog is all about innovation. How do we have continuous land? How do we bring in technology for the farmer to improve the productivity you mentioned? Because from 45 to 2 is a huge way.
It's a huge way, but we can take our time. Okay. So we have to be going at the speed at which the economy can absorb things without being inflationary. What we do know is that that has been done, so we know that that's the potential. We know in the long run that it's already being done, so it's not out of reach. But what we do know is that there is a pace at which technology will penetrate, best practices will penetrate, and as long as we ensure that the services sector and certain segments of manufacturing absorb this excess, we will be in good shape.
Right.
So
right.
Professor Harsh, yes, there is a caveat here, and that is that we have to be very careful, because when we talk about going from 45 to 2, we are talking about people we are displacing, moving from one sector to the other. And we must remember that the 20th century was about automating manufacturing. And the 21st century, with robotics and artificial intelligence and what have you, is going to be largely about automating services. Right? And we have to, we really have to learn to deal with that, because where will all these people go and what will they do?
But
because what you've managed in the 20th century is to move people from manufacturing or agriculture into services. When your services begin to get automated, where will people go? What will they do?
But
That's going to be
Professor
a
Harsh,
huge
every
challenge.
time a new innovation technology has come, haven't the humanity had such apprehensions? But in hindsight, you believe that that happened for good?
Yes, I am a firm believer that we will innovation, eventually human spirit overcomes these challenges. But I think that the question, of course, is the transition.
Yes.
And I think the transition and particularly in India, where I think we still think about it. 4 years back, we were not even talking of these sorts of issues. Today we are talking about these in public platforms. Our Prime Minister is talking about these issues in global platforms. G-20 is taking up the future of work as one of its major priorities. So I think there's a real concern across the world in terms of what this means for not only countries like India, but even for developed economies. And I think, as Ambassador Prakash made a very important point, we should be very careful in terms of the politics, which is changing. So the migration issue is front and center. People are not willing to accept others. So that will change the complexion of global politics and economics.
Absolutely. So the complexion of the global economics will continue to change. Perhaps in the world that we're living in now is much more volatile and dynamic than ever before. But then again, you've got the leaders at the highest level willing to come together, whether at the G20 summit or the United Nations or the other multilateral forums. Like you said, multilateral sometimes turns into many lateral, but still conversation and dialogue always will yield meaningful results. Thank you to all my panelists for joining us today. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.